I was thinking about the podcast. I was rewatching our last session, and I feel like we've been talking about a lot of kind of more heavy stuff.
We did or we did not?
We did.
Yeah,
I
did.
think so. And so I kind of wanted this to just be a sort of, you know how every great sitcom will throw in a variety episode where they just kind of rehash old episodes and they do little splices and stuff like that?
Okay.
That's what I kind of wanted today's session to be like. So, yeah, wanted to be a little more casual just because, I don't know. I don't want people to get the impression that it's just got it. Like what we were talking about was this idea of like dance, monkey, dance.
I think it's tough.
Yeah.
That's what I'm feeling about this podcast. Is it requires you to be in this place where you're like, oh, I've got to generate interesting content. It's not like a true crimes podcast. You're like,
Yeah.
and then next week we'll tell you what the neighbor was doing.
Yeah. Next week, we'll talk about Alex's relationship with, so-and-so. His second uncle,
Yeah. So
Greg.
I think about what happens in real therapy. Is that sometimes you go and I don't have anything to talk about this week. There's nothing, I don't have anything to work on.
Yeah, or the things that you do have to work on are not so obvious right away.
Possible. Mm-hmm.
That's kind of always been my experience, is that I'll walk in being like, because I used to show up when I was younger, I would show up to therapy with like a notepad.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, these are the things I've been thinking about. These are the things I want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And then oftentimes we would go in a completely different direction and wouldn't end up covering those things. And I would feel just as good, if not better. Like, oh, these actual things weren't the things bothering me. It was actually this. So yeah, I don't have too much to discuss in terms of specific plights. Is that the right word? Plights? A plight?
If it's a plight, yeah, that's the right word.
Life is good. I've been getting more feedback on the podcast. More and more people are reaching out, which
And are they like your close friends? People who are
no, they're typically friends or like fringe.
French friends?
Like not to, and I say that if you're listening, like a fringe friend doesn't mean I think of you less than a friend. It's just more like we don't talk a lot.
Yeah, you're not getting a Christmas card.
Yeah. Everyone is special. But yeah, people I haven't talked to in a while, we'll just shoot a note, say, hey, this is really cool. One thing I have been getting a few times, and it's sort of, I don't know how I feel about it, is I've been getting this like, wow, this is really brave of you. And like, I think I get what they're saying, but it also kind of, I don't know, makes me a little uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable thinking that, like, do people think I'm doing this to demonstrate how brave I am? Or like I want a medal for what I'm doing and put myself out there?
Or that I'm doing something stupid. Or, like, oh, you're brave. Like I would never have done that because it's not very smart to do, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I know they most likely don't mean it that way, but there is something to be said about like, I think a lot of people look at this as being very vulnerable for public consumption or to an audience.
Yeah.
And I know I look at that as more of a byproduct of the work that we're doing and like what we're trying to do. That's just, a byproduct of it as opposed to the point of this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, people have been positive. I got one really interesting comment from a complete stranger on our talk about dissociation.
Oh,
and they were like, it was kind of flooring in a way, because they were like, I've spent so much time trying to figure out, quote unquote, what's wrong with me, and I've never been able to articulate it until watching this.
Oh, okay.
And that was like positive, but also I was like, whoa.
What did you feel, like a mantle upon you, or a weight? A weight of I didn't realize people were going to take it that way, or
What it made me think of was, so I once upon a time made a music video that kind of blew up on the internet,
Uh-huh.
and a bunch of comments came rolling in. And I remember my biggest takeaway from that was that the average internet user has really poor spelling. When I saw this comment, the feeling it left me was like, whoa, there are a lot of people who are probably like really hurting. Like, I think what was so crazy to me, or what was so like profound to me, was that this person was struggling with something, and their recourse was to interact with a complete stranger, as like they seemed to not have any other options.
Mm.
And that to me was really heavy. And that to me made me sad. And I started to think, like, I wonder how widespread, not suffering, but like I sort of, the more comments I get of people being like, oh, I have this too, or like, I relate to this. It's like you sort of wonder how many people are suffering in some way out there and just like aren't talking about it and don't have anyone to talk about it with. That to me is what, like, it doesn't make me feel like, I don't know. It doesn't feel burdensome. It just makes me sad to think how much struggle is out there, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
The world needs more therapists, I guess.
Well, I think part of what you wanted to do this for was to give people
Yes.
a glimpse into what could be for them,
100%.
right?
And it would make me happy, for example, this user, if this wasn't the comment they made, if that was like just the first step, right?
In getting some kind of help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't imagine it would go from, so tell me why you're here. Well, I left a comment on a TikTok, and now I decided to go to therapy. Like, it's not that big of a jump, but maybe that comment leads to more. I was like, hey, you should research. Here's some terms to look into, and maybe that'll be illuminating in terms of like whatever you're going through. So maybe they go down that rabbit hole, and that leads to something else. I don't know.
Right.
But yeah, it has been cool to see people interact with it, and we're starting to get more followers from like your world, which is interesting.
Like
I can see
peers.
or
like mine.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
Mhm. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's the part I'm more concerned about, because
Yeah.
in a way you're putting yourself out there in a very bold way. You're putting yourself out there, and that's why people are saying you're so courageous. And I'm like, all right, which one of my colleagues is going to pick up on that? I didn't go to this, or I didn't ask that question, or I didn't go here. And so, and I'm sure I'm not the best therapist in the world. And I'm sure there's many better therapists. Of course, I didn't tell that to you when we started. So
I think that is something that maybe listeners might not appreciate. Like, it's very easy to say that I have quote unquote skin in the game,
yeah,
right? I'm putting myself out there. But I think people overlook the fact that you are equally putting yourself out there. And I mentioned this in the very first episode. It took so long to get this project off the ground
yeah,
because so many therapists that I talked to were just not, they didn't want to put themselves in that position. I think for that very reason, which it's very challenging to have the peanut gallery.
I think though for me, that was a consideration at some point, but at the same time, I'm a big believer in the fact that there are many ways to do therapy, and many of them are helpful. And the bottom line is what I think I said in one of our first shows: when you share your humanity with somebody else, that is, I think, one of the things that we do as therapists is we provide a space for people to come and talk to us and be real with another human being. And I think that is probably one of the biggest things that people take out of therapy. And you can do that with me. You can do that with the next person and the next person.
100%. And it's almost like the greatest skill. Well, and this is coming from a patient, right? So it's just my perspective. But the ability to create trust, a feeling of trust, is probably the most like worthwhile attribute. Like that's how I gauge any therapist is this idea, can I trust them? Because I'm going to be sharing with them. And so, yeah, an ability.
But how do you know that? How do you know you're going to be able to trust somebody?
So I can answer that very practically. How I approached it was just like, you know, like when a wild animal, they like poke around, you know, sniff around, and they, you know, will come up and look at you and then run back.
Yeah.
That's kind of my approach, had always been like I would share small bits of me and see how they react.
Yeah.
And if I felt like, okay, I'm not getting judged right away,
Mm-hmm.
they're listening, then I'd share a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And that was my process.
Yeah. And that's been your process in multiple domains, not just this, right? Is my guess.
Yeah, very accurate. Yep.
Right. That's how you and Haley began. That's how you do it with, you know, school teacher. I mean, that's the recipe for developing intimacy. You still had to risk. You still had to put yourself out there. And I think that's, you know, like people will say things like, I need to be able to trust you. I don't think you get trust until you risk.
Yes.
You don't get intimacy until you open yourself up and expose yourself to being ridiculed possibly or made fun of in some way.
Yes.
And it's only after you gauge that perception. How was that received? How did, you know, oh, it was safe with this little thing that I shared. Maybe it'll be safe with this other bigger thing that I share.
I think what makes me sad is thinking about how many people in life like had one negative reaction, right? They were vulnerable, and that was the moment when they needed to be reassured the most, and they didn't get it exactly. And so that immediately was like, well, I'm never opening up again. I think that's what makes me so sad. I not to vicissitude, right? But I think that's one of, like, you talk about, you know, like the tragedies of being human. I think that's one of them. This idea that I can't connect with other humans because I had some bad experiences in my past. But I 100% agree with you, is that from every relationship I've had and I have in my life, those bonds were made stronger by, even more broadly, like trials and tribulation, like shared suffering, or like shared struggle.
Yeah.
I think about like this term camaraderie. Like you always hear soldiers talking about like the bonds of, you know, of war and like that brotherhood. I mean, that's vastly different, but in a basic sense, it's like when you are being vulnerable so when your life is in someone else's hands, like that's intimacy, that's trust. I mean, there's no greater trust than that. So Haley and I do this couple thing where we put each other's lives in each other's hands. So we'll do something really dangerous, and like the only way I live is if she.
Are these scenarios, or do you actual things like hanging from a bridge? Or?
Yeah, like hanging from a bridge, and we just do like really dangerous stuff, and so we can learn to trust each other. No, I'm just kidding. We don't know. Just a dumb joke. But yeah, it's funny that you picked up on that, because like I've always been very measured. People look at me as like, oh, you're very outgoing. You seem very comfortable in public. I had to pitch cool story to a bunch of students. There's like 50 students in the room just when I was at this thing a little bit ago. And one of them came up to me. She's like, your vibe was like, you seem so confident in front of people. And I was like, yeah, I'm nervous. I'm just as anxious as everyone else. But it's like, I've baby stepped my way everywhere.
Right.
Anytime I'm in like a large group, I'll feel it out. I'll feel people out. And then if I feel comfortable or secure, then I'll just start being myself.
Yeah.
And that process can be terrifying. Do you interact with, like, I'm sure you have, but patients who you can tell right off the bat, like, this is going to take some time to gain their trust?
Sometimes people be coming in off a bad experience with therapy, and they'll let me know that, and I'll be like, okay, I gotta really listen. I really want to make sure people feel heard. Sometimes at the end of the session, I'll say, you know, what did you feel? You know, did you feel heard by me? Did you feel understood?
That's cool.
And so I want to check that out if I have any concerns that maybe they're not hearing that. I also can sometimes inappropriately use humor. Not inappropriate, but sometimes I use humor because things are funny to me and they don't land funny on clients. So I have to back away from that. And
that's awkward.
But I also think that humor is a part of the way people can connect. So I don't not have humor in my sessions typically.
So just to clarify, have you been using humor in our sessions?
If you have to ask, no.
Got him.
Yeah, I'll let you know when that happens.
That is interesting. Like, in you just will pick up on when you're like, okay, this didn't land the way I wanted to.
Yeah.
Or will they
sometimes.
say something?
Usually they don't say
Yeah,
anything. It's
right.
like,
That's the challenge.
that didn't land where I wanted to. So
I think to that end, humor is how we process a lot of stuff. It makes a lot of scary stuff less scary. So I always default to humor.
well, and for me, humor in my family was the way that we escaped real feelings, and so that was one of the big things I had to learn in grad school. Was like, okay, when you're thinking of something funny, is it an escape from the seriousness of a moment? And had to temper that. And
That's interesting. I probably do that. I wonder if I do that. I feel like I typically appreciate heavy moments, and I'm not like deflecting and
Trying to get out
hide.
of it.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I think it's more so like just a broader coping mechanism of like, wow, this kind of sucks, but what are you gonna do? We're all gonna die, so let's just buckle up and get through it. Make some jokes, and yeah, just a way of like surviving, I suppose, as opposed to running, hiding away, temporary comfort. Like drinking a ice cold glass of lemonade on a sweltering day. It's like the lemonade doesn't escape. I mean, it's still hot out. It just gives you some respite for 30 seconds and then you're back into it.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at humor. So yeah. What are some things that, not to put you on the spot, maybe that's what the theme of this episode is.
Put me
Putting
on the
Dr.
spot.
Steve on the spot. How the turntables.
The turntables have turned.
Right? Are you familiar with The Office?
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. What are some things? Are there any observations about the work that we've done that you feel comfortable sharing, or things that you've noted through our?
When I talk to people about the podcast, and I don't talk to a lot of people, because I've been in Minnesota long enough to know not to draw attention to myself. And
So you loved the part in the episode where I talked about all your accolades.
Yeah, that was not a good. Yeah, so I tell people, I don't know where that was, but I tell people like, yeah, we kind of started getting into our groove around the 4th episode.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I kind of look at it, because I don't know if you or I really knew what it was. Well, is it going to be therapy? Is it going to be a podcast about therapy? And sometimes we were in both of those worlds, right? Sometimes it was about therapy, and sometimes it was about. It was therapy, and sometimes it was about therapy. And the last time that we met, you said something to me off camera, off recorder,
Off record.
off record about, hey, I think I'm figuring you out. You're kind of a no nonsense, like you're kind of an OG therapist. Like don't wallow in it, go to it. And I'm like, well, Alex, I think I'm mustering up as much compassion as the content that we're talking about, but you're not. You haven't been talking about real heavy things. Some heavy things that you've struggled with and come to terms with. And in that time, you said, "Well, Steve, there's other stuff I'm not really sharing. I'm not ready to give that to the world and around certain domains, right?" Mm-hmm. And I have a respect for what you want to accomplish with the podcast. What we want to accomplish with the podcast is broaden the conversation on mental health. But I also know that you're not at a place, and I don't expect you to be at a place where everything gets shared with the whole world.
No, yeah.
I think most people would say there are things in my life that I'm not even sure I want to give to a therapist, let alone a therapist on camera, on audio,
Yes.
Like out to the world. So I think that we have some restraints and some limitations that I think probably should be there for your own protection, maybe my own protection. I don't know, but
Yep. And so let me ask you.
so I don't know if I am answering the question or not.
You're not, but that's okay.
Okay.
I want to ask you, press you a little bit, or I don't know the right way of describing this, but so were you not? Did you have a strong reaction to when I said, "Hey, I get this like OG vibe from you"?
Mm-hmm.
Did that feel like, well, hey, that's not like? I feel like you kind of had to justify that by being like, well, you're not giving me enough. That's
Yeah.
why I'm reacting that way.
Yeah.
And so what was it? Did it feel like,
Yeah, it felt a little bit like, well, I'm only doing what I can,
Yeah.
I'm only can react to what I'm hearing, and so
which obviously
and you're a person who's had a lot of therapy,
yeah,
and so you start this venture, not as a neophyte, not as a newbie, you're
seasoned vet.
you're a seasoned vet,
Yeah.
and my guess is, unlike a lot of the people who may be listening to us,
Millions.
the millions who are listening to us,
Yep.
unlike a lot of people who maybe haven't had any therapy experience, who struggle just to tell people that are close to them things that are near and dear to their heart.
That is kind of it's always interesting to consider. And I think that is something that I personally need that reminder and context a lot. And Haley will tell me that all the time. It's like, dude, you feel so like you have to understand the vast majority of people, like just they're not even aware of it yet. They don't even know. They don't think about it consciously. Some subjects, and you think about them and share them, so it can be like really overwhelming. But back to my original question, I think I was more so thinking like in terms of like the subjects we've talked about, or some of the things that have been bothering me and things that I've been dealing with. Like, is there anything you've noticed about like me as a person or thing? Just like have you quote unquote been taking any notes in your therapist journal about like, okay, Alex is exhibiting X, Y, and Z, and blah 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 blah.
I haven't.
Yeah.
I haven't felt a need to do a full mental status exam and do like a regimented treatment plan and goals for this work. I've approached this more like I'm going to show up and Alex is going to drive the content, and what he's going to get from me is someone who has training in some training in a mental health background, and specifically relationally oriented mental health. I mean, that's my emphasis is to think about relationships and how they impact individuals and their environments and things like that.
Yeah, I know we talked about this in our last session because we went, we kind of started touching upon stuff where I was like, yeah, I can't go there.
Right.
That was really fascinating. I think it is a core element of this podcast, and it's not like I don't want to go there. I do go there. I just can't do it. There's certain things I can't talk about bluntly because there's certain things I can't share because they involve other people. I can't like quote unquote like I don't want to not out, but you know what I mean.
Right. And if you had
in the conversation that doesn't want to be in the conversation.
Right. And if you had the rules associated with typical therapy, which is confidentiality, like, I mean, I can still keep these things confidential, but when you're talking into a microphone, you're not keeping things confidential, right?
Not.
So if there's stuff that you want to talk about with members of your family that are, and our families know us intimately, like they've seen us naked, they've changed us, they've seen us in our worst, we've seen them in their worst, and I think that's what happens in family life is you get to know people in a different kind of a way than other people who are not your family. And so if you've got things that you want to talk about, you'd want to be able to do that with somebody where you'd say, I don't want this going anywhere because I haven't figured out how I think about it just yet. And I'm trying to figure it out. And maybe by talking to somebody, I can figure out where I'm at with this particular aspect of my relationship to my siblings, my folks, my grandparents, or this family history, this legacy. But I'm not going to go and think about that out in the open with everybody. I need to think about it in a place that's confined and has some rules around.
One fear that I have, and this speaks to this idea of I can't just share everything, is my worry with this particular format is that in being very vulnerable, I might say something that I haven't like fully processed or thought through. Right. So I can put my foot in my mouth basically.
Yeah.
Or say something that I don't really mean, but maybe I only mean it like 10%. and
Yeah.
I'm still trying to figure out how to articulate it.
And you can't control how that lands on somebody else. So
Yeah,
it lands on the
exactly.
other person like a 90%.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
This is the totality of how Alex thinks about me or our
Yes.
relationship. Or,
Yeah. So that's always in the back of my mind. That's not to say, but that's not to say I'm at all like burdened by that. Like again, that's part of this format. I still think even the conversations we're having right now, I think continue to be helpful for people because again, it's just like any opportunity. I want to give people the chance to see what it is like to experience therapy, which is to experience sharing humanity with an individual.
Yeah.
Right. And right now, in this very moment, I'm more or less sharing whatever is in my brain. Like I'm not filtering it too hard. And while the subject matter might seem very light, right? I think the process of what we're doing is still cool for people to see, right? Because it's like unfiltered expression and attempting to connect over anything. So that's why I always at the end of the day feel cool about what we are capable of doing versus what we are incapable of doing. But yeah, I'm like definitely, I'm like very afraid one of these days I'll say something where it's like, oh, I haven't completely thought that through. And it's like, oh, too late, canceled.
Yeah, it's out there.
He's cut him off.
Yeah.
But even that's just the name of the game. That's existing in the media landscape. And I'm curious, one thing, this is my perspective of academia.
Yeah.
So understand that's where I'm coming from. But I look at academia as pretty tricky too to navigate in terms of like you have to make doubly sure that you're not offending anyone. Is that, I mean, what's that like? Is that accurate? Is that not accurate?
Yeah, but academia is a lot different than therapy,
Yeah. No, 100%.
right?
Yes. Yeah. But I feel like there's an element too of like, you can't just like fully express. I don't know. Just curious if you see any corollaries between like what we're talking about and what life in academia is like.
No, I don't. At first blush, I would say I don't see corollaries between academia and what goes on in therapy.
Yeah. No, just in terms of like this idea of
Because I do think because what you're hitting on is this idea of political correctness, and what can be said, what can't be said.
yeah.
Which is fascinating because the academic realm should be a realm of discovery and, building understanding.
Yeah.
But if I can't say anything because I'm worried about offending somebody,
Totally.
then I'm limited in how much I can understand a phenomenon. If I'm worried about offending you, just to ask questions, then I've I've hijacked the process of getting to know
Yep.
somebody more. And will somebody allow me to be ignorant about something as I pursue more understanding and truth about something?
So similarity to therapy, right? It's like therapy is going to be regulated by my inability. If I fear being able to share aspects of myself for judgment,
For judgment. Yeah.
it's going to limit my ability to create a meaningful conversation.
When I started my therapy training in Syracuse, I was meeting with a client, and into our fourth session, she said, "I have something to tell you." She goes, "My name is really blank," and I'm like, "Oh, okay." And it's not, my last name is this, not this other thing I told you. And it was like a vetting process for her.
She had made up a total different name.
Different name. You didn't need to know my name, but now I'm comfortable with you, and so I'm telling you my real name. So,
Fascinating.
and by the way, I don't work over here. I work at this other
Yeah.
place. So this whole other
Created like a character.
yeah.
That is fascinating.
Just because she was nervous about being open and honest
and
in
being
that space.
judged.
Yeah.
It is a terrifying thing, the feeling of being judged, and it is probably one of the biggest hurdle in any relationship. Trust. I look at it as, for me personally, it's fear of being judged, like being met with anger or cast aside, right? Ostracized.
This process, what we're doing.
Yeah,
or-
and like how I interact, like relationships wise, and when I'm speaking publicly or when I'm creating, like for art's sake. Like
Yeah.
my number one fear is my authenticity, me expressing my thoughts and feelings will lead to me being cast aside and cut off. That's like what scares me the most.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that people will think I'm dumb,
Mm.
not necessarily, or something like that, that they'll just be like, well, we don't like you, go away. You're on, you're kicked out of the,
Out of the tribe.
yep.
Mhm.
Yep. Which is, you'd think I'd be okay with it because I put myself out there all the time.
But I just see that as a normal part of
Yeah.
human behavior. I mean, from wanting to fit in and when you're in grade school to wanting to fit in when you're at university and frat in your fraternity or sorority or, whatever organization you belong to, whether it's 3M or something, Target, whatever.
I struggled. So I used to work in advertising, the
Uh-huh.
agency setting, and it was not lost upon me how that idea of needing to fit in, it like never really leaves, unfortunately. It's just always there. And this idea of like the corporate ladder, and you had to be in with certain people so your trajectory could be on path, and like that whole process makes me very uncomfortable, and it feels very inauthentic. It's just yeah. So that was one of the motivators for me to leave, because I wanted to get out of that environment.
Mm-hmm.
But it persists everywhere, and
Right.
it's kind of stinks. I wish people could just, I don't know where it comes from. Like, who was the first human that was like, okay, I need to compare myself to you, and I need to compare myself to you, and you need to know that I'm better than you. Like, I hate that whole thing, and I don't get why we do it. Why can't we be like, oh, I'm me, I'm cool, that person's them, they're cool, we're all happy.
Don't have an answer.
We're going to kick it over to Steve for the answer,
Yeah,
and
No, and cut. And scene. I don't have an answer for that.
yeah. I always,
But I do think, okay, maybe I do have an answer.
oh, he's got an answer.
No, I just think it's because we only know ourselves in relation to other people. That we constantly look and, am I as heavy as that person? Am I as tall as that person? Am I as good looking as that person? Am I funny as that person? Like this person's funnier than me. This person's smarter than I am. This person's, not as athletic as I am.
So our sense of identity exists in relation to other identities.
in
Yeah.
relation to other people.
People,
Right? That's
yeah.
how you know
You don't
yourself.
Don't exist. The self doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
Not to get even more vicissitude, but it's kind of like a color exists in relation to other colors. Like, is this weird? Like, red is only red because it's not blue, or like it looks different than blue. That's why red is red. Yeah, no.
Red is red because of the kind of light that we have in our
Yeah, okay.
Earth. Okay, that's what
Yeah.
that's what I understand, right?
Yeah.
The spectrum is because of the certain light that we have.
Yeah, it is. I always like to think about the things that I struggle with in terms of like being able to relate to humans, other people.
Yeah.
And I often ask myself, like, what is the evolutionary benefit of me having, like, where did these thoughts and stuff come from? And if they came from other people, where did they get them from? Like, what benefit? It seems some kind of weird trick to play on humans, to be like, hey, you're going to have all these cool things, but you're also going to be plagued by doubt, and like, it's going to be hard for you to be intimate with others because you're going to worry about being judged and stuff like that.
Mm. Yeah. That's a deep question.
Yeah.
We need a cultural anthropologist
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
answer those kinds of questions.
Yeah. But in terms of, going back to our discussion about sort of human intimacy, and you had asked, how do you open up to a therapist? I do appreciate how scary it can sometimes seem.
I think that's the thing that therapists can forget. That we can kind of be in this world so much where the expectation is, I sit down, you sit down, now you start opening up to me. And so I think we may need a reminder every now and then. We may need reminders about how hard that is for people to come in. And the most common number of sessions that people have like historically, is one.
Yeah.
So most people go to one therapy session and never go back, or I don't know if it means that they got what they needed from that one session, but it's there's a lot of people that are kind of one and done and don't try again.
Do you think that's because, if you had to take a guess?
Number of reasons. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's because I checked the box. I went to therapy. It wasn't helpful. That's because I talked to the therapist and he took my wife's position instead of mine. I talked to the therapist and the therapist didn't understand me, or I did that just to get my mom off my bed. Like
There's millions of reasons.
hundreds of reasons, right?
Yeah. That is fascinating to think. Just one and done.
I have a colleague who takes students to Cambodia and Laos and Thailand, and she takes our undergraduate students who want to become mental health professionals, and they were talking to a shaman. I may not be getting the story exactly right, but one of the students said, "I want to be a therapist," and they were like, "What is a therapist? What does a therapist do?" This is another culture who's looking at us through these students and saying, "Oh, you want to you're training to be a shaman, right? You're training to be like a community elder." That's why we have community elders. They're the
spiritual guides.
Guides who kind of you can go
That's
to and talk to, and but we do it for pay. We do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're a shaman.
God bless America.
Yeah, capitalism, woo woo. And it also kind of reminds me too of like when you were saying you're talking about your daughter had listened to the podcast and been like, well, does Alex need therapy? What's his deal?
Yeah.
And it's like, it kind of reminds me of that shaman's response where he's like, oh, well, you're talking, it's about environment. It's relative to the environment that your cultural environment. In this case, like your family, your daughter probably existed in a world where these kinds of conversations were happening all the time.
That's what she's saying.
Yeah.
Because now she's married, and she's married to a guy who doesn't talk as much as she does.
Mm-hmm.
That may be gender, that may be family of origin, a variety of reasons. And he's a great guy. But she's like, I think in my family, I was raised by a therapist, and so we ended up talking. That was kind of the currency that we had.
Yep. Yeah, not the current. Yeah, completely different experience. I'm just polar opposite. So, but it reminded me of like that shaman's reaction, which was like, "Oh,
you're training to be a community elder."
Yeah. Yep. So, are you, with you being a shaman, does that mean like we're going on some crazy trip here or something like that?
That I go on a crazy trip, or the two of us go on a crazy
There's
trip?
going to be some spiritual guidance with ayahuasca or something like that.
I don't know. Is there some substance we can be incorporating?
No.
I have
Well,
a
that
glass
leads
of
us
water.
to our sponsor. We'd like to thank. No, I'm just kidding.
We don't have a sponsor.
No, Dave left us.
Dave
one and
out.
done. One and done.
Just like other people.
But yeah, very fascinating stuff. And I'm going to very quickly wind this session down. But to anyone wondering like what the first session is like and whether or not it's scary and like, yes to everything. And I personally have always approached it as just little baby steps, giving a little more, like, I gave my real name, but I felt comfortable doing that. But like, I think that's a great example of like, do whatever you have to do to build trust and feel safe, and then go from there.
And realize that you don't get trust, you don't get safety until you risk.
Yep.
That's the other thing. So there's a lot of people who will say, I can't share with you because I don't trust you. You need to make me feel safe. It doesn't work that way, people.
Yeah. You have to.
You have to co-create safety.
Yep. Takes two to tango. And that doesn't mean it's not scary. Totally is scary. But, to the millions of listeners, you're very brave. You're a lot braver than you give yourself credit for. So take the leap. Take the blue pill. Or is it the red pill? I don't remember. But yeah, thank you for having a chat with me about human intimacy and trust and all that good stuff. I hope I wasn't too vicissitude-y for you. You know how I get.
All right. Have a good week. Till next time.
Till next time, stay happy, people.